Hi friends, welcome to the fifth week of our class, Race and American Politics. Today, we will be discussing a very important phenomenon, which is known as white backlash. Okay, so we will try to understand and explain the origins and consequences of this phenomenon through the readings of Craig and Jefferson, Samuel Huntington, and Abarjano and Hoynal. Okay, so I hope I am pronouncing their name correctly. Anyway, so what is white backlash? Today, you can see numerous headlines everywhere about like kind of important signals or alarms, which indicate that American nation will be a majority-minority nation in the near future, okay? Which simply means that the people with minority backgrounds, people with non-white backgrounds will make up the plurality of American nation. So many news outlets, many newspapers, many politicians, many scholars, they are all pointing out the different dates for this political shift to happen. Why is that the case? Actually, if you remember the discussion, especially the discussion that you had like in your blog platform, the censuses through which we detect, we trace, we track the demographic trends actually have some disadvantages or have some defects, like inherent problems in clarifying the exact picture. Why? As we know, in recent decades, in recent census, people who are otherwise classified as whites, they started to like express themselves as multiracial or mixed racial in this population census. Or in other phenomena, like many people who are otherwise classified, like categorized as a Hispanic racial group, they are tendentious. They have the inclinations to mark themselves as the member of a white race. Why? Because they have a different understanding of the cleavage, of the boundaries, of the historical formation of different racial groups, which they inherited from their locality that they immigrated from, right? So, as a result of these FE issues, it is impossible to determine the exact date of this political shift. Is it important? Not exactly. What is kind of more or less certain, as long as the current demographic trends, like the reproduction rate or maybe like immigration of non-white groups into the country continues, yeah, this American nation will be a majority minority nation in the near future. This empirical issue or like this empirical estimation is a worrisome development for some people, especially for some white people. What are the origins of this worrisome development? In order to understand it, first, we need to maybe deconstruct what nation means, okay? According to the like widespread, mostly agreed definition of national identity, nation is an imagined community which is imagined, limited, and so on. This definition is developed by a very famous scholar, Benedict Anderson. So let's go over each of these terms one by one, okay? It's an imagined community. Why do you need imagination while making sense of a national group? In your everyday life, you only have the opportunity to encounter a handful number of people, right? However, if I ask you how many members that does the American nation have, the answers would be more than 300 million people. But it is impossible for us to personally click, to personally meet, to personally encounter with these people. So their presence are beyond the reach of our everyday experience. Okay, so how do we complete these missing elements in the picture? By just imagining. Okay, the imaginary part like comes from this issue. So it's also a community. It is a community among horizontal comradeship. Okay, which means that in the definition of national membership, national identity, being a part of a certain nation, we need to see that there is not an inherited, there is not a fixed, there is not an immutable hierarchy, like vertical orientation, vertical organization. So the national identity should be among the people who are equal to one another. Okay, so the communitarian aspect comes from this issue. So it is imagined as a limited construct. What does that mean? The national identity, national membership relies on distinctiveness from other nations. Okay, so unlike monotheist like religions like Christianity, like Islam, the followers of these monotheistic religions can imagine, can dream of a world where everyone becomes Christian, where everyone becomes Muslim. So this whole idea of Christendom, this whole idea of Ummah is kind of a cornerstone in the belief systems of these religions, which have universalistic expressions. However, a nation generally doesn't dream itself as a identity which should be shared by everyone in the world one day, right? This is why we like exclude like people from national identity. This is why we want to prevent their immigration. This is why we are so much giving so much importance to the issue of citizenship. So the nationness relies on certain privileges, certain features that we believe that only we share, dissimilar to other groups. Okay, so the limited part comes from this issue, and it is a sovereign community. What does that mean? In the modern times, in the nation states, in the most of the nation states, let's say there are some exceptions which are, let's say, ruled by like theocrats or monarchical rulers, we know that the ideal sense, in the ideal sense of the term, the legitimacy comes from the people, right? The simple definition of democracy, for example, the rule of the people, by the people, for the people. So the rulers, they believe that, they claim that they are ruling the country for the people. They are receiving their legitimacy through the popular will of the people. Okay, they don't claim that they are the representative of God in the world, or they don't claim that, okay, I am the ruler because I am the member of X dynastic rule. This is the case. This is the basic element of a democratic rule. Also, many like non-democratic, like kind of authoritarian polities around the world, they claim themselves as the true representatives of people. Okay, so in the modern times, the sovereignty, ideally, on paper, in theory, should belong to the nation, should belong to the people making up the nation. Okay, so this is an imagined community. So how one understands this imagined community, this national identity, how one makes sense of the people sharing these co-national membership actually change from people to people. So, for example, in the United States, these official documentations like Constitution, they don't necessarily, most of the time, like point out a significant, a singular racial group or a singular language group as the true member of a national community, right? But the people's understanding of who counts as a national member actually changes. So as we see, actually, from the essay of Samuel Huntington, actually, he understands the American nation as people who are sharing certain descriptive characteristics. So these characteristics are being white, being Anglo-Saxon, being Protestant, or speaking English as a native language. Okay, so does any of these elements like take place, like at least officially, at least directly in the Constitution? Possibly no, not right. But this doesn't negate the significance of this nation imagination for Huntington, for example. And when people like Samuel Huntington, who understand the nation as people sharing some singular ascriptive characteristics, when these people learn, when these people are primed of this upcoming demographic shift inside the country, so they are tendentious to react to this political phenomenon by how, as Craig and Jefferson showed, they are reacting to this political phenomenon by adopting much more conservative political ideologies and by supporting more conservative policy choices. What does that mean? Although it was not always the case historically, today, in the 2022, being a conservative is more or less equal to being a Republican. So when these white people, they are primed of, when they are asked about this demographic change, they are likely to be much more Republican, especially these are like people, bipartisan people, or those who like qualify themselves as independent voters. Okay, independent white voters, they are more likely to be Republican. Also, though, they are more likely to support conservative policy choices. What is a conservative policy choice? There are like some like cultural elements and there are some economic elements. So cultural elements, for example, maybe supporting policies which would make the immigration of non-white groups much harder, right? So restrictive immigration policies, like restrictive citizenship policies, okay? Economic conservatism is also relying on the idea of minimal state intervention, state role in the economy. Why is that important? We all know that today, non-white minority groups are more likely to become economically like poor, right? They have higher needs of, let's say, public support for education, for healthcare, for safety nets. So the economic conservatives, they actually advocate the idea of minimizing state role in the economic processes and lower level of taxation, because higher level of taxation and higher state engagement, involvement in economy actually turns into like much more advanced safety nets, higher degree of like social welfare provisions, higher degree of support for health insurance or education or vouchers. So they don't want these other non-white groups to enjoy these like provisions. So they are more likely to become Republican, since the Republican Party today like represents the conservative like branch of the American society, and they are more likely to adopt conservative policies. These are the findings, okay? And Craig and Jefferson argues that the reason, the mechanism between these two, like the priming of this demographic shift and the output or the outcome of this support or adoption of conservative ideology and conservative policy stances, is what they call group status threat, okay? So we argued that in the start of the lecture, nations should be horizontal. But for some people, only people with certain characteristics, like Samuel Huntington embodied, only people with certain characters should be the first class members of this nation, imagined national community, right? So there is a group status element there. So by being a white, by being born into this collectivity, so I want to be much more privileged. I want to be the first class group in this national imagination. So there is a group status there. You are earning this status by carrying this membership to a specific racial group. And you are claiming that this privileged status should be preserved in this nation. Okay. So your imagination of American nation is a construct that's there where there is a like horizontal relationship, comradeship between the white groups, but you are like at best neglecting the presence of non-white groups as the co-members of this national community. So there is a group status element, and the idea, the fact that non-white groups will become the plurality or majority one day, triggering these group status anxiety. Okay. So there is an important mediating factor for mechanism. Okay. On the other hand, Aberjano and Hoynal, actually they are developing a much comprehensive theoretical framework to explain, to understand why there is a connection between these white backlash and adoption of certain like exclusionary, like conservative ideologies and policy choices. So their actual theory is very like meaningful, or it makes more sense, very intuitive. So this theory is constituted by certain elements. These elements are first, like immigration, which actually drives the political change of this democratic backlash, actually is a widespread phenomenon, right? Today, no matter whether you find immigration as a positive or negative development, you are sure that it is an important thing which takes place in the nation. Millions of people are coming to the United States. So it is a very large, very broad phenomenon that which is unlikely to slide from people's attention. Okay, so it's a widespread phenomenon first. But there can be many other widespread phenomena, right? However, what is distinctive about immigration is there is an anti-immigration threat narrative. Actually, is produced by certain parties, by certain TV channels, by certain news outlets, by certain civil society organizations. So there are competing visions, competing frameworks, competing discourses to make sense of how this immigration, this widespread immigration issue will result. Okay. So there's an important anti-immigration threat. And this anti-immigration threat actually is embraced by some people. Why? Because this very widespread major event actually is linked to many different policy domains, right? So the number of immigrants, so the racial or ethnic or religious identities of these immigrants is important for the United States. Why? Because this country is relying on the idea of birthright citizenship. So the people, the offsprings of the immigrants will be the American nation. They will acquire the right to vote. And their votes, their demographic weights will determine how the economic resources, like federal funds, okay, for example, or political resources like political power, like representation, like the positions of like political parties competing to acquire higher votes. The issue of immigration actually is likely to determine the allocation of economic and political resources in the country. Okay, so this is an important issue which links to numerous policy domains. It's related to welfare issue. It's related to the issue of representation. It is related to the issue of participation, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So this was the third element. First, widespread. Second, anti-immigration narrative. Third, it is linked to many different political messages at the same time. And fourth, actually, today, it is a very contemporary phenomenon that both parties actually diverge from one another with regard to their stance on immigration. Okay. This was not the case, let's say, 3 decades ago, 4 decades ago, 5 decades. It is a matter of, let's say, last 15 years or something. Okay. So today, the Republican Party, their cadres, their constituencies, their extended party networks, they are more likely embracing the idea of anti-immigrant stances. So they want to limit immigration of certain groups. They are more cautious. They are more anxious about the flow of immigrant groups, especially the Hispanic groups. Okay. The Democratic Party, their constituencies, their extended party networks, their intellectuals, on the other hand, are more likely to embrace immigration as a positive, as an invigorating development. Okay. So if you think that immigration is an important issue in the United States today, which many people think, then your party identification, your vote choice is very easy to determine. Why? Both parties, they diverge from one another with regards to the issue of immigration. Okay. This divergence, this distance between these political parties actually is also leading to the polarization between the constituency group of these parties. Why? Because these parties, they started to address different social groups, different constituency groups. They started to develop different discursive strategies, different rhetorical tools, different ideologies. They started to embrace different policy spaces, different political stances. Okay, so today, let's say compared to maybe 5 decades ago, 4 decades ago, these parties have less in common. They remain fewer, very little, like cross-cutting identities between these two groups. Okay, so today we cannot talk about an expansive like middle ground, like between these two political like parties and their constituency groups, which leads to the issue of effective polarization. Okay, which makes it more likely to an average white person who is bothered with this issue of immigration to embrace the Republican tendencies and to be much more conservative, adopt conservative ideology and political stances. And the whole mechanism is unfolding as a result of the alignment of these constitutive elements, according to Aberjano and Hoynal. Okay, so this is the brief discussion on the meaning, origins, and consequences of what is called white backlash in the United States today. So next week, actually, we will try to understand how minority background people actually react to this burgeoning, like salient white backlash inside the country. Okay, so there is a like dialectical element. There is like important interaction between these different social groups. So as a result of this demographic shift, most of the time, the white people are reacting with this white backlash. This white backlash triggers like certain political outcomes. And in return to these political outcomes, this time, non-white groups or people with racial minority backgrounds adopt much different reactive strategies, which we will be like talking about next week. Okay, so thanks so much for listening to our 5th week lecture, and I am looking forward to seeing you, even if virtually, in the lecture for the last week. Okay, so Keep on your great work in the blog discussions and take care.